Hello, everyone, and welcome to this edition here of the Jason Hagholm Sports Experience. And I am joined one more time here by the BlueJay Hunter, Ian Hunter. I mean, you may be wondering, why are we talking baseball in January? Well, if you're a BlueJay fan, there's a lot of bits needs to be talked about here with this baseball team, and we'll try to get into some Baseball Hall of Fame stuff as that just went down this past week with some new inductees going in. So first of all, Ian, welcome back.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. Thanks for having me.
All right, Ian. So first of all, I guess maybe before we get into the baseball, today is a pretty important day. Just what are your quick thoughts on, not trying to get too political here, but on Trump getting not even elected, but like sworn in his inauguration? That was quite a surreal day for me.
Yeah, it was bizarre. Like every time I would watch the television, I thought, is this an alternate reality? Like this, I'm still, even though he's been sworn in, he is the president of the United States now. It still doesn't feel real to me. And I think it's going to take a lot of people like me months, if not years, to realize that, yes, in fact, this is our reality, that a millionaire, Donald Trump, is the president.
It totally felt surreal. It honestly felt like a bad episode of The West Wing or something for a lot of it for me. It's going to be weird. And then his speech of America First is, as Canadians, it's going to be very interesting times now with President Trump, and it's still weird to say. But moving over to the realm of baseball, obviously, Ian, the big news of the week was for the Blue Jays has been they finally re-signed Jose Bautista in a weird situation in its own right, where these two kind of are just left to fall for each other.
Yeah, I don't think that Jose, but the Jays won't say it, but I don't think Jose Bautista was their first choice to fill the outfield. I think he was probably their plan D, after missing out on Dexter Fowler, missing out on Edwin Encarnacion. There were a few trade rumors that fell through, allegedly for Andrew McCutchen, and they apparently kicked the tires on Charlie Blackmon and a few others. But so it's a marriage of convenience is what people are calling it, and I mean I'm fine with that. I think the draft pick compensation really hurt Jose Bautista's chances this offseason because there's not a lot of teams that are going to be willing to give up that draft pick for a 36-year-old player who's coming off a season where he had 2 DL stints. And although at times Bautista was impressive last year, his overall body of work, it was not great going into free agency. So that made a lot of people very leery of signing him. And the Blue Jays didn't have to give up a pick. And honestly, I think Jose Bautista himself, as a brand, he would fare better in Canada anyway. So that's why I think it was a good move for the Jays. And really, there weren't that many options out there on the market, and Jose Bautista was the best available one. So I think that's why they did it, and it looks like a good deal to me.
Well, I think it looks like a good deal in the sense of it's only a 1-year deal, $18 million. There's obviously options on it. I don't see them going back and renewing the options at the end of this deal. But to me, it seemed also like a deal that while these two were kind of just left for each other, it's a deal the Jays had to make in some senses to just make their fan base happy, considering they lost Edwin Encarnacion to Cleveland, and a lot of the fan base was really upset at the organization.
Yeah, and you heard some rumors over the weekend that the Cleveland Indians apparently had interest in signing Bautista as well. And then I think it was on Sunday that the Orioles were apparently kicking the tires. So, I mean, can you imagine if the Cleveland Indians also signed Jose Bautista? I think Blue Jays fans probably would have burned the city to the ground. So it really was it was a good move for the Jays, and it could have been a PR nightmare if he went somewhere like Cleveland or Baltimore.
Well, I mean, it's interesting that Baltimore was going to re-kick the tires, considering their general manager pretty much said they weren't going to sign him because their fans hated him, with obviously the history between the Jays and the Orioles as of late. But this signing, though, to me, there can be an upside to it if Bautista fills the roles that we've seen from him before, where Edwin last year was the real big contributor with Jose being hurt. But to me, do you think we'll see a motivated Jose Bautista is what I'm getting at here, Ian?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, he's got everything to prove this year because he, almost went unsigned this winter, which, if you go back to last spring, he laid down his contract demands of, he didn't want to accept anything less than $150 million and he wasn't going to take a hometown discount. And, a year later, he's crawling back to the Blue Jays to sign essentially a 1-year deal. And it can be a little bit humbling, but I think Jose Bautista is the kind of player who does play with a chip on his shoulder generally. And I think he'll be that much more motivated this year because if he doesn't have a great year, the Blue Jays and he don't come to a mutual option for next year, and then he has to do this song and dance all over again. So it's only beneficial for him to have a strong 2017 campaign and help the Blue Jays out.
Now, Bautista signed here. What do you think else the Blue Jays need to get? Because I think Bautista coming back, and obviously he's had great success here in a Blue Jay uniform, more so than any other team. Last year obviously was a lot due to his numbers aren't really great due to injury, and him being motivated can do that. But what do the Jays need to do to really take the next step to be contenders? Because they've been in the postseason the past 2 years, just haven't got past that ALCS.
Right. I mean, you could... I guess Boston is kind of the gold standard right now in the division. They look to be, they're the team to beat, right? After they, especially after they got Chris Sale. I mean, that kind of put them over the top as AL East favorites. However, I think the Jays, I mean, they're a really strong team. You could argue that they still need to go get maybe another outfielder or a platoon partner for an outfielder, like someone like Melvin Upton Jr. There was rumors about Brandon Moss, formerly of the St. Louis Cardinals, that could maybe be a platoon option for him. But I think that their outfield's pretty much set. The relief, the bullpen is the big area they need to address because they really don't have a reliable lefty right now. Aaron Loop is your token left-handed reliever, which is probably going to frighten a lot of people. And the back end of the bullpen consists of Roberto Osuna and Jason Grilli and Joe Biagini and maybe a few spare parts. But luckily, there's still a lot of arms on the market right now. I think the Jays are probably going to get someone like a Travis Wood or a Boone Logan or Jeremy Blevins. I mean, they're not the sexy names. It's not an Aroldis Chapman or an Andrew Miller, but I mean, they're going to fill a void. And I think they could probably, sign some under the radar guys because we're like a month and change until spring training. So these guys are going to want to sign. Blue Jays also need a backup catcher. I really don't take too much stock in a backup catcher. I think Russell Martin's going to be catching the bulk of the games anyway. They may choose to get someone like AJ Jimenez and call him up from the minor leagues, potentially as a backup. But there's a few other guys out there like a Kurt Suzuki. But again, these are just smaller moves. I think the big move was the Jose Bautista signing, and now that that's happened, they can kind of fill in the rest of the team with some low end signings and some under the radar guys.
And the other big acquisition for them this offseason, I guess you can say, would be Kendrys Morales. How do you see him fitting into this team now that they got Bautista back?
You know what? I've come around on him. I think if the Jays didn't sign Jose Bautista, they were in trouble to replace a lot of that power that they lost because they would have had all those home runs walking out the door from Bautista, Encarnacion, and Michael Saunders. So replacing that with Kendrys Morales and Steve Pearce, you're really not matching that production. Jose Bautista kind of bumps that up. I think there's a lot of people who think that Kendrys Morales is going to have a pretty solid season in Toronto, mostly because he's going from a pitcher-friendly park at Kauffman in Kansas City to a home run haven in Toronto. And there's some people who even think that he could get the same kind of bump that Josh Donaldson got from going from Oakland to Toronto. I don't know if it's going to be that big, but I think you can. I mean, if healthy, you can pencil in Kendrys Morales for 30 home runs. And I mean, this could be. I mean, the thing is, he's only signed for like $11 million a season. So there's really a potential for it to be a value deal. And I think ultimately he's going to have a pretty good year. So long as he can stay on his feet, you can pencil him in for 30 home runs easily.
And he hit 30 home runs last season with the Royals, so that would be much needed for the Jays offense now that they don't have Edwin anymore as well. So, I mean, it's going to be interesting. I think the only thing really missing for the Jays is just some speed guys.
Yeah, that would have been filled. That void would have filled with someone like Dexter Fowler, and he was. It sounds like that was the dream get for the Blue Jays this offseason because he checked so many boxes. He was a left-handed hitter, a switch hitter. He had speed. He was an outfielder, and he could also hit for power. But I mean, the Jays just came up short. I guess they got outbid by the Cardinals, and I think the Jays, more or less, their identity from last year is pretty much the same as this year. They're still very right-handed. You're subtracting a left-hander and Michael Saunders, replacing him with Kendrys Morales, but still you're very right-handed dominant. If anything, I think the Jays are a little less strikeout prone this year, which is good. And I mean, if you can get some speed, that's great. But ultimately, I think the identity of this team will be similar to last year. They're going to be a home run hitting team. And I mean, that's fine by me because the last 2 years that got them into the playoffs and all the way to the ALCS.
Just got to find ways to come through in those one-run tight game situations. That's the only thing that's really kept them back. Their pitching was really good. We're able to, as you said, take it to 2 ALCSs in a row. Just couldn't really compete with the pitching that Cleveland had last year. But remember how exciting that ALCS was 2 seasons ago against the Royals. So it's going to be, I think to me, they're still a contender, even though the AL East got really good this offseason.
And the thing was, too, like watching this team down the stretch last year was really painful because they were just their weaknesses were so apparent. It was so easy to attack this team, and the Cleveland Indians they picked apart the Blue Jays. Like, they did not look like the same team that made it to the postseason and just decimated the Texas Rangers. So I think that's why everyone around the Blue Jays in the front office said, okay, we need to get more left-handed. We need to get less strikeout prone. And I think they tried to, but just the players they were looking at were just either they got outbid or they just couldn't land them in trade. So they decided to go status quo. And the Kendrys Morales thing, he is a switch hitter, so there's a little bit of versatility there. But for the most part, it's a very similar lineup to last year.
You know, speaking of this team as a whole off-season wise, obviously being a contender, I think helps, and having free agents be, looking towards them. But the one thing I've always found is, do you think Rogers kind of putting the clenches on this team to go after guys is going to be a hindrance as we get down the stretch in this season, or even by the All-Star break, depending? I mean, obviously they can make moves potentially, but they just, now that there's certain new direction with this team, there seems to be a little bit hindrance on doing things.
Well, if anything, I think maybe the pocketbooks have opened up. We heard this week from Jeff Blair saying that apparently Edward Rogers had okayed or given the Blue Jays more money to sign Jose Bautista. And if anything, I think that's a positive sign because then you've got ownership who's willing to bump up the payroll if they need to. I don't think you necessarily just go and turn into the Los Angeles Dodgers and spend frivolously because that's not the way to do it. I think if the Jays if they're in contention come July and there's someone like an Andrew McCutchen out there who, I mean, you're taking on a bit of payroll, I think ultimately Mark Shapiro is going to be given the green light because why wouldn't you make a move like that to better your team? If anything, I think there might be objection to, clearing out the farm system to getting a player like that. But it sounds like every interaction that Mark Shapiro has had, he's gotten the green light to go ahead and spend what he needs to. And I think it's only a positive sign. To
me, it is a positive sign if they're starting to open up the pocketbooks because there's another sports team in Toronto that's done really well. It had their best season of all time last year, the Raptors, and they just seem so unwilling to do anything. So I think the Jays, obviously 2 years in a row, postseason, 2 championship series in the American League, they know that they need to take that next step, and that's just a sign in a positive direction for a team with a fan base that's just wanting a little more right now.
Yeah, baseball's a little different as well because it's not the salary cap system. So in baseball, I mean, you see teams like the Boston Red Sox, they outspend their mistakes. I mean, if Pablo Sandoval goes down, well, that's no big deal because it's just money. Whereas in the NHL or the NBA, you can't make a mistake like that because then you're taking a huge salary cap hit. But I don't think the Jays have recently, like the last big contract, really albatross contract that was on the books was Vernon Wells. And Anthopoulos found a way to ship it out. I don't know how, but ever since then, you haven't really seen the Blue Jays spend big money because they know that it could come back to bite them in the end.
Well, it's going to be an interesting look at this team. I think we're obviously still really excited about what the Jays can offer. There's a whole country behind them. And speaking on that tip, the Blue Jays got a new uniform today, Ian. This all-red jersey to, in some aspects they're saying to commemorate with Canada's 150th birthday this year. They'll wear it for every Sunday home game and specific games in July. What are your thoughts on this jersey, first of all?
Yeah, it's
they call it an issue for some reason.
Yeah, it's a hot button topic. I guess they're new-ish. They're not. It's the same base jersey, but they just it's monochromatic red. It's just red and white. There is not a stitch of blue on this uniform, and I think it's weird because I don't know if you've noticed this, but I would say within the last 5 years, the uniform and jersey culture or a news cycle has been, people are really ravenous for things like this, and people are very interested in new uniforms. So I think the Blue Jays wanted to capitalize on this, and I don't blame them. But there really are only so many variations of this uniform they can do. They've had Canada Day jerseys in the past, and they've been solid red, or they've had the logo on the side or on the top, a leaf on the top. And this is just a slightly different variation. I think there's no sense in splitting hairs about it, but it's a cool thing to talk about. And luckily Jose Bautista signed this week, because otherwise this talk would have dominated headlines all week long.
All right, yes, I can't imagine the Jersey Gate talk on all sports talk radio out in this market here. But I mean, first of all, to me, they're fine. I mean, they at least have a point to why they decided to go with these all reds, tying it into Canada's 150th birthday. And to me, I mean, new jerseys are another form of a cash grab. And people that are complaining about them, you'll see them at, the Rogers Center this summer rocking those jerseys anyway. So it's a win for the Jays as a whole.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm not gonna be rushing out to buy one, but I think it's cool that they bring it out. They're gonna bring it out every week. The one thing it kind of reminded me of, I don't know if you remember Flashback Fridays from, I don't know, it was maybe 5-10 years ago. Every Friday, the Blue Jays would wear their old baby blue jerseys, and those were pretty polarizing. People either loved them or hated them. But it's a similar vein, right? It just gives people something to talk about, and at least they get to wear the Reds a little more often, which is kind of cool.
And at least it's not like a logo change, because do you remember when they changed from after they made their first logo change in the late 90s, and then they had that one J with the baseball bat? That was the worst logo ever for this team.
I don't know which one was worse, the T-Bird or the one, the angry Jay, the teal Jay, the one prior to this one. The Blue Jays have had, I mean, they're pretty young in terms of MLB teams in their history, but they've had some pretty awful logos, that's for sure.
Well, I mean, I was always a fan of, I like the original and I like obviously the World Series jerseys, just growing up with that, I still think they're the best. Like, I haven't bought a new BlueJay jersey ever. Like, I'm still rocking Joe Carter's and Robbie Alomar, like either spring training or actual jerseys. But like, to me, that was the best logo in sports, period. But the one before they altered the original logo was awful. And black, like, what does that have to do with anything?
Yeah, I tweeted about that earlier today. I said, if you guys are upset about these Canada Day jerseys, the Blue Jays have had some pretty much more awful uniforms in their history. So it's much ado about nothing.
And yeah, that one before they even went to that black jersey with the Angry Jay, like that logo lasted 1 year because it was so bad.
Yeah, it was not good. I mean, some people like it, but for the most part, those are just critically panned and deservingly so.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank God they threw those designs in the dumpster right after that 2000 season. And lastly here on the Jays, I mean, it's becoming another silly story, but apparently Marcus Stroman and Aaron Sanchez aren't getting along. They're not as tight as they used to be. It's become news, and I think obviously, as mentioned before, I think this wouldn't be as big of a story. This would be a bigger story had the Jays not signed Bautista, but let's just talk about this for a little bit because I think people in Jays Nation would love to talk about this. So Aaron Sanchez and Marcus Stroman not as tight as they used to be.
They're no longer best friends. And I feel like this is something that should be in Tiger Beat magazine. And
Tiger Beat taking it back, Ian.
Yeah, not talking about on a podcast, but it's kind of fun and it's interesting. Like this is something Marcus Stroman talked about this. This is something that we never would have noticed or talked about 10 years ago because we can't go in to Marcus Stroman's follower list or Aaron Sanchez's follower list and see if they're still following each other anymore or tweeting about each other anymore. And I think they probably aren't best buddies anymore. I don't know why they are, but I mean, if you think about it, right, like you probably aren't best friends with the best friend you were with in kindergarten or maybe even high school or college. Like people have falling out. They're not best buddies anymore. I don't think it's that big of a deal. It's not going to affect their performance on the field, but it's fun to talk about. I mean, this is obviously the winter.
Yeah, that's true.
These things dominate the headlines. If this were to happen in season, I don't think it would get much press, but we have nothing to talk about, so we have to create something to talk about.
Well, it's also the Toronto sports market where they just feed on anything right now. But my only serious question on this is per se them not being tight as tight as they used to, because that clubhouse seems so family like. And if this kind of starts a bit of an issue here, could you see the Jays kind of falling apart in terms of the clubhouse?
Well, I mean, if these two guys are falling apart, then and things are going bad, then everything's going to fall apart. And it's kind of akin to something that happened in the Blue Jays clubhouse. I want to say it was like 2009, 2008, where it was right near the tail end of Cito Gaston's second tour, and there was reports of unrest in the Blue Jays clubhouse, and people were just not happy at all. And I mean, this was when the team was in the midst of their 22-year playoff drought, and just nobody's happy when the team is losing. So I mean, if this team loses, they're going to be unhappy. But as with anything, winning cures everything. If Josh Donaldson is acting out, nobody's going to care because the team's winning. These things only come about when there's either inactivity or nothing else to talk about, or the team's not performing well.
Well, obviously we'll have to wait and see how the team performs, as we're still a couple months or so away from the start of spring training. So at least be a while before we see the Jays in action. But when you just say that, though, it's kind of hard to believe that we're almost at that point already, Ian.
Yeah, I mean, once February hits, I think that's kind of the finish line towards spring training. I don't know the exact pitchers and catchers report date, but it's just over a month and change. And then once that hits, once you start watching spring training games, it starts to feel like, okay, baseball is finally around the corner, and also winter's soon going to end. So there's light at the end of the tunnel very shortly.
Light at the end of the tunnel. And, for some major baseball potential Hall of Famers, the light definitely, or Hall of Famers now, the light is at the end of the tunnel as the Major League, or baseball, has elected their class of 2017 Hall of Famers. And in a class I thought I was pretty impressed with. I think they've got it right the past couple years in terms of Hall of Famers. Obviously naming Jeff Bagwell, Pudge, Ivan Rodriguez, and Tim Raines, the former Montreal Expo great. First of all, Ian, your thoughts on the class?
Well, I'm impressed. I think relieved is probably the word that a lot of people used to see a Tim Raines get in, because Jonah Carey's been on this crusade to get him into the Hall of Fame, and it's really positive to see the change in Hall of Fame voting. I would say within the last 5 years, I think you're starting to see a lot more sabermetric friendly players looked at in a whole new light. So people are starting to look at the numbers and recognize that, okay, well, maybe Tim Raines wasn't a 3,000 hit guy, but he still deserves to be in the Hall of Fame. Someone like Fred McGriff, who I think he fell off the ballot this year. He almost hit 500 home runs, but yet he's not even considered. So I think no longer voters are looking at these thresholds like 300 wins, 500 home runs, 3,000 hits. You're starting to see guys like Roger Clemens and Barry Bonds, who were accused of performance-enhancing drug use. They got a huge bump this year. And Jeff Bagwell was never really confirmed to be using performance-enhancing drugs, but there was a lot of suspicions about it. And there was rumors with Ivan Rodriguez as well. So you're starting to see a turn in the tide in Hall of Fame voting, which is really positive. And you're finally starting to see the guys who deserve to get in are getting in. And that's the hallmark that I saw from this year's class of Raines, Bagwell, and Rodriguez, is that we're overlooking, character flaws and things like allegations of performance enhancing drugs, and looking at their numbers and realizing, yes, they are Hall of Famers.
And I always thought it's ridiculous to look at, character issues to keep people out of a Hall of Fame, whether it be baseball or Pro Football Hall of Fame. I mean, Christ, the Pro Football Hall of Fame almost didn't put Lawrence Taylor in because he did that match with Bam Bam Bigelow at WrestleMania 11. Like, to put the greatest linebacker not in the Hall of Fame would be crazy. But how do you think we got to this point with voters changing? Because I think it's for the better of this Hall of Fame.
I think, not to typecast people, but I think now the benefits of things like sabermetrics and advanced statistics, we're starting to see the value that these players had. Because, in the past, really all you had were, just your baseline statistics. You looked at a guy's sheet and, his batting average, his home runs, and his RBIs for a hitter. Those were the hallmarks. And for a pitcher, you looked at wins and losses and ERA, and that was it. Now you're starting to see things like, weighted runs created plus and wins above replacement and ISO and OPS and all sorts of advanced statistics. You're starting to see that, yes, these guys were incredibly valuable. And I think that's brought on by, a bit of a younger fan base and younger writers as well, as we're starting to see the older writers kind of drop off, but also older writers are starting to come around as well and starting to realize the value in things like advanced statistics. So I think that's why you're starting to see things change. And I think it's only going to continue that way as we are starting to get more and more advanced statistics and analytics in baseball.
So Tim Raines is obviously we live in Canada. That's a big talking point here. We're all happy for Tim because I think he takes his rightful place. But do you think Tim Raines gets into the Hall of Fame if he doesn't have someone like to champion like Jonah Carey? Or do you think the way voting has changed would have eventually got him in?
You know what? Considering that I think this was his last year on the ballot.
Yeah, it was his last.
Yeah, I don't know if it weren't for this campaign for him to get in, I don't know if it would have happened, because he got something like a 12% bump this year, I believe. And so otherwise it's just word of mouth. And then so why all of a sudden would people change their minds? People aren't going to go back and look at Tim Raines' statistics unless they've got somebody like Jonah Carey championing this and saying, come on, like, you've got it. You have to get him in here. He's one of the best left fielders of all time, and it would be egregious for him to not be in Cooperstown.
And I think as well, like, we're seeing the bumps in the likes of Bonds and Clemens, but those were players that, had fantastic careers, turned around a lot of franchises, Barry Bonds winning NL MVP with both Pittsburgh and San Francisco. And I think people are obviously letting the steroid thing kind of evaporate a little bit, with the exception of a lot of guys getting in that were, rumored to have taken steroids. So I think it's really interesting to see because, Fred McGriff, you brought up his name. I mean, I think Fred McGriff potentially should be in this Hall of Fame, but he didn't have anyone campaigning for the crime dog.
No, I mean, if we had somebody up north here, I think he would have got a lot more eyeballs and a lot more attention. And he was, I mean, for him, just a quick backstory on him, he was kind of like one of the forgotten first basemen of that era. And also, I think it was because he didn't hit 500 home runs. I think he was something like 493 home runs. Like, he was so incredibly close. And he just needed that little bit of a bump. And if it weren't for that threshold number, he probably would have got in. But I think ultimately, especially with guys like Bonds and Clemens, I mean, yes, they probably did use PEDs, but they were still at the time the best players in all of baseball. And steroids were rampant back then. And if it was easy to hit 73 home runs, everybody would have done it. But only Barry Bonds set a new record. Roger Clemens was dominant there for like a 5-year stretch. I mean, when he came to the Jays for those 2 years, he was incredible, whether he was on steroids or not. So you have to recognize that and just kind of acknowledge that at the time everybody was probably doing it. So it's hard to ignore all these statistics, because if they don't get in, then nobody gets in.
And the way I look at it is, it's not like steroids made Barry Bonds a great hitter, or Roger Clemens a fantastic pitcher. I mean, they already were top of the class, in the mid to late 80s or early 90s. It's just, it added that extra bit of power and velocity. But if everyone's doing it, it's kind of hard to patrol everyone like that. Plus, testing wasn't a real thing up until the early 2000s.
Right. I mean, these guys were going to... Barry Bonds was a gifted athlete. Yeah. Roger Clemens was a gifted pitcher. And allegedly, performance-enhancing drugs just made them that much better. I'm willing to bet if they didn't take PEDs, they probably would have put up similar results anyway. It's just the fact that it tipped the scales a little bit further for them.
Absolutely. And I think, all these baseball purists want to bash the steroid use, but without steroids and the McGwire-Sosa chase, who knows if baseball survives for a good majority of people.
Well, yeah, I mean, I was in with that era as well. I was a Blue Jays fan up until, the baseball strike of '94. And I think a lot of people, I mean, I was a young kid back then, but after that, I had absolutely no interest in baseball until the Sosa McGwire home run chase. And it brought a lot of people back into baseball. And I think, Bud Selig turned a blind eye to it. I think he probably knew what was going on, but I mean, baseball was fledgling back then. They needed to get back in the good graces. And McGwire and Sosa helped revive the game, and they brought a lot of baseball fans back, myself included. And it was a fun era. In retrospect, everybody was juicing, but it was fun to watch. And I'm kind of grateful that it happened. Well, not that it happened the way it did, but that I did get back into baseball, because otherwise, who knows? I might be watching football right now or something. Who knows?
And I think the biggest thing was it made America fall in love with its pastime again. And I think, obviously, baseball's had so many great moments since that 1998 season that I don't know if the eyeballs are really on there. Yes, the Yankees were contenders, and that really helps a lot. But just the play of Sosa and McGuire, that was everything to a lot of people. That made me fall in love with baseball even more so, because obviously the early success of the Jays, I was just, 3 or 4 at the time, but I really got into baseball on that hunt.
Yeah, it's cool. It's cool because like you and I, it's a similar story. Like, people got back into baseball, and I think the Blue Jays, the past few years, there's been a huge resurgence. Like, I remember 5 and 6 years ago, going to Blue Jays games, and there's like 10,000 people, and all of a sudden, like, everybody's talking about it. It's January, and people are rabid about Blue Jays news, any kind of Blue Jays news, like to do with the jersey or two teammates feuding. Like, this wouldn't have happened 5 years ago, and this is now the next, at least with the Blue Jays, the era of fans coming in, and it's really cool to see.
It is really cool to see. And, just to kind of wrap it up here on Tim Raines, obviously he gets in, a former Montreal Expo. Vlad Guerrero, on his first attempt, had 71% of the vote. So, Ian, my question for you is, there's a lot of rumblings been going around. Do you see Montreal within the next 5 to 10 years getting the Expos back?
I think it's probably closer to 10. It's, from what I've heard from Jonah Carey, he sounds like he said that so long as there's a financial backer, that it's eventually going to happen. And it sounds like Rob Manfred is confident that he wants to expand into other markets. Maybe it's not just Montreal. Maybe it's somewhere like Vancouver, because you saw how well the Jays traveled this year, especially in Seattle, and that was a lot of Canadian baseball fans down there. So I think Montreal's on the horizon, and there's just because you've got 30 million people to tap into, and there's only one ball team right now. So it only makes sense for them to bring a team back into Montreal. And it's, akin to the Winnipeg Jets. I think people are going to start to get ravenous and really want another ball team in this country, and I'm all for it. I think it's going to take a long time. I don't know where they're going to play. The Big O is
that's a disaster.
It needs a lot of work. I don't know if they would play there, and then if you have to build a stadium, that would take years, and you've got to find funding. So I think that's why it's probably going to be closer to a decade, maybe a little less, before if you do see baseball back in Montreal.
Well, it'll be very interesting to see, Ian, because I think a lot of people want it to happen there. People feel really bad how things ended. They had plans to build a new stadium in the 94 season, but as we all know, the strike ended a lot of those plans. So it'll be real interesting to see what happens with Montreal. But happy to see Montreal Expo fans get to celebrate with Tim Raines going to the Hall of Fame.
Right, and then you've also got those Blue Jays exhibition games every March. I think they're playing the Pirates this year. So it may not be an MLB team or a Montreal Expos team, but at least they get something.
But they also get such a fantastic turnout. What would this be, year 4 of the exhibition games in Montreal? And the turnout is just incredible. It's like a playoff game.
Right. People are just, maybe that probably raised a lot of eyebrows. And maybe Manfred took a look at that and said, you know what, maybe we should take a really a strong second look at bringing a team back to Montreal, because if there's that many people filling the stadium for exhibition games, maybe they could extrapolate that over a full season with the team coming back to Montreal.
And the only thing I think to really get momentum is that Commissioner Manfred is quite a champion for Montreal, and it's very rare that you see commissioners of major pro sports leagues in North America try to champion a Canadian team that isn't, or Canadian city that isn't Toronto.
Right. I mean, I really like what I've seen from him so far. I think he realizes that there is a lot of potential there, and also a potential out west as well. Because I think if you expand one team, it kind of makes things a little more difficult. So you've probably got to go to multi-markets. But if baseball is going to expand, I would definitely put Montreal at the top of the list.
Just randomly last. Where else would you see? Obviously, we've talked Montreal, Vancouver. Where else potentially in the States would Mexico maybe be an area that you could see a baseball team in 10, 15 years?
Yeah, with the travel over the border and the
Trump
and Donald Trump, that could throw a wrench into things. I was going to say somewhere like Las Vegas, because it seems like that's the place to go right now with hockey going there and football rumored to come back. But I believe the Jays had a farm team out there a long time ago, the Las Vegas 51s. It seems it was barren back then, but maybe with all the new sports teams coming in, Las Vegas is another place to go. Other than that, and maybe Vancouver or Montreal, I don't know of any other potential markets, but I'm sure there's lots of cities lining up and making their case for it.
Well, Ian, I've obviously enjoyed, almost an hour talking to you about baseball, the Jays, the Hall of Fame, what have you. Before I let you go, though, plug your stuff, because you do such great work on your own website.
Oh, well, thank you very much. Yeah, you can find my stuff at BlueJayHunter.com, also on Twitter at BlueJayHunter, talking lots of Blue Jays stuff this week with the Jose Bautista signing and the Jose Bautista news. And there's a press conference tomorrow on Saturday at 1:30, so I'll probably be talking about that and getting ready for spring training, because it's just right around the corner.
And obviously, if you're not a follower of Ian on Twitter, I just want to ask Ian, how sad are you that Vine is dying? Because I'm devastated.
Yeah, it's pretty unfortunate, but luckily we still have our Twitter GIFs, which is good, and embedded Twitter video. But there's lots of great Jays Vines out there, and it's unfortunate to see them move on. But I'm sure we'll have lots of interesting things to GIF and memes to watch for the next year or two. Yeah,
it's just right around the corner, Ian, as we have already discussed. Spring training's before you know it, and then before you know it, first pitch at the beginning of April. But that's going to do it for this edition of the Jason Hackholm Sports Experience. Peace out, and have a good weekend, everyone.